Good evening, Erev Tov. I didn't hear the music, Andrea. That's why I didn't talk. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining me and our community for another evening called Erev Tov, which is good evening. And this week, we're going to be focused and running the program differently than the last month of running this show. I know that I have come out here every week and try to distract everybody from COVID, from being isolated, from being at home. And we've started with happy hour time, and I would make a drink, and we'd have a human interest person come and tell us about who they are, somebody in our local community, and get to know them. Well, we're still going to be getting to know somebody from our community tonight, but unfortunately, it's not a time for happy hour. And so, even though I'm sitting in the same place, my heart and soul are in a very different place today as we see our work to fight racism, systemic racism, bigotry, hatred seems to have gone steps backwards. And as the Jewish community, as I would identify myself as a Jew, a woman, a mother, a rabbi, a human being, all of these elements of who I am all bring me back to my core value of Torah, of learning, of teaching, and of justice. And we are far from justice, and we are going to spend some time this evening learning more about racial justice, learning about becoming an ally, learning what is systemic racism. We have learned so many new words over the last 2 months, but you may not be familiar with the idea of systemic racism. You know, when my middle daughter started her Master's of Social Work program at Columbia, the first few months of the program is really breaking down what it's like to be a person of white privilege. What does that mean? How is your world different from other people's? And it took me a while because my Jewish narrative of oppression always rose to the surface, and I was even at times maybe threatened by the idea that I have to put that aside or think about missions for the Jewish people rather than the oppression that we definitely have suffered through and at times still do. And I had to open up my mind and my heart to see, well, where else am I responsible for what happens today in our world? Where am I responsible for people of color and how they live their lives, and the difference of how I am privileged to live my life? And when we have tragedies of the kind that we've had with the murder of George Floyd and the other people, mostly black men, who have lost their lives, and another word I'm becoming more and more term, I'm becoming more and more familiar with, the extrajudicial um, extrajudicial, now I forgot the word, extrajudicial punishments of capital punishment. And I realized we still have a big gap and a lot to learn, and really a way to begin to think about ourselves and our roles differently. And so I've brought in an expert, or somebody that I think is an expert, more expert than I am. We've been working at the temple on a racial justice reading group, and we've been learning. But I've gone to the University of Miami and to bring forth the Dean of the School of Education and Human Development, Dr. Laura Cohn-Wood, who has done work in race and strengthening races and ethnicity and culture, promotion of strengths. I have to look at her CV because it's a lot of very different and interesting things. And I've invited Dr. Cohn-Wood to share with us her expertise on racism, on becoming an ally, and her own unique experiences and who she is as a person. She's a member of our Miami community at the University of Miami. And as we do our own work for racial justice, part of it is getting to know who's out there, who are our partners, whom can we learn from. So, Dr. Cohnwood, come on in. And she's sitting behind a beautiful screen where her father lives in an island off of Seattle, or a key, we call those keys, right? Off of Seattle, and it looks very different from Miami. I can almost breathe that fresh, cool air, unlike of what we're having outside. I thank you so much for being here, and I welcome you to Erev Tov. I welcome you to the greater Temple Beth community. Last week we had viewers in Germany, in Israel, all over the country. So this platform this week is going to be used to make a difference, to live our Torah values, and Dr. Cohnwood is going to help us get there. We're all on different paths, and we're all in different places, and we should not be embarrassed by where we are in our thinking or understanding. We should not be fearful, but we should be ready to take the next steps and learn. So thank you, Dr. Cohnwood. And I'm going to ask you a little bit. So you are Dean of the School of Education and Human Development, and you have Temple members who work in that school. And of course, my daughter just graduated from that school at the University of Miami, so I have an extra warm place in my heart for you and for that school that has done wonders in her critical thinking and looking at the world. So thank you.
So thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here, and I am not an expert, but I'm really, it's a privilege to be able to share my thoughts with you. So thank you.
Thank you. So let's start. Tell us a little bit about what are some of those really interesting programs you've gotten started at the university. What is a community and social change program? What does it mean to have a program in community well-being? How does this affect who we are today and our struggle for racial justice?
Yeah, so I grew up in Seattle, and as you mentioned, the background behind me is from an area called Paulsbo out in Bainbridge Island. But I came here to Miami about 11 years ago to help start some new programs as part of the vision of the previous dean, Isaac Perel-Eltensky, who is a community psychologist. My PhD is in clinical psychology, but I identify as a community psychologist because of the values of the field. And so as part of his vision for the School of Education, more than 12 years ago, it was to really have our school be about psychological, educational, and physical well-being. This is part of what Dean Perel-Eltensky has brought to the field of psychology and to the world. And so in doing so, he proposed some new programs. And so I came from University of Michigan, again, about 11 years ago to help start these new programs. The first was an undergraduate major in human and social development. The programs I directed previously was this new master's program in community and social change. And essentially, that program is designed to use the principles, theories, and constructs of community psychology, which is a small field that not many people have heard of, and apply them to the sort of nonprofit NGO landscape. So the idea is to train people working in nonprofits, practitioners in educational settings, or other community-based organizations to try to utilize some of the theories of the field, which are very different. We kind of have this sense that we're at a point in history with nonprofits that there's been a lot of money that have cycled through nonprofits to communities to try to help with things like education, employment, et cetera. And there hasn't been really widespread change. And so we think that it may be partly because of the way the work is being done, that it focuses, as we do so often, on more easily conceptual and approachable kinds of units of analysis, like really trying to work one individual at a time, tutor that one kid to get them somewhere, provide job training to this one person, do work with a homeless individual, and then expect that individual by individual, we're going to be able to see broad scale changes. And that's just not the case. So The field of community psychology really functions on, broader levels of analysis and units of intervention than just the individual, and also tries to focus on things like prevention versus treatment or intervention after the problem has already occurred. So that's the Community and Social Change program. It's a 30-credit master's program in the School of Education. And then a few years after that, we started a PhD program. We call it Community Wellbeing, with the idea that this would be the program to train the scholars who would do the research that underlies the kinds of interventions we would hope to see in the community.
So if I would understand this, it's not just bringing books into the underprivileged school that doesn't have a large enough library. It's not the task, it's looking at the system as a whole. And
Exactly.
and that sort of really fits into the idea of when we look at systems, when we look at racism, and we see how is this system lasted. I used to think about racism as people of one race not liking another race, or white people making it difficult or not liking black people, again, on that individual level, right? This person I don't like, or this person I don't trust. But if we look at it as a system, then it goes much deeper and has really much wider reach, and as you said, much more difficult to change. It wouldn't be just changing how it's helpful to change one educator's view on the children in their own classroom, but this is bigger. So can you explain a little bit, what is it, how is racism part of a system, and how is something a systemic racism?
Yeah, well, I think one way to think about it is to kind of take a step back and start to question, why is it that we have to spend so much time, energy, effort, educating one child at a time, providing a scholarship here and there so that a child can ascend, in an educational space? Why is it that, for example, if you look at the CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, there's still in 2020 very few women. And if you say to yourself that it's not that I think that particular children are less able to learn or less intelligent, or it's not that women are less able to lead or less able to ascend to the highest levels of a company. There must be something else. It must be something other than individual deficits that keep happening over and over and over again. And so that's when you start to realize that there's ways in which there's been systems, policies, procedures over many years of time that have acted to thwart the ability for certain people and certain groups to ascend. If you accept, if you're willing to accept, oh, I just think that, often what we hear in education is, the parents just aren't engaged, or the children are, I don't know, name your individual, blame the victim, kind of construct, then, there's not a whole lot that I can do with you, because I think that that's a much easier way to conceptualize things and a much more manageable way to think about how to intervene. But it really is only going to change things one person at a time. And it also, if you think about the fact that we have a really wonderful narrative, I think, in this country at least, that if you work really hard, whether it's in school or in your occupation, that you can ascend and, become the top of whatever. I think it's very difficult for people to, marry that narrative, which is true for some people, for a lot of people, with the fact that there's a lot of deep levels of unfairness in how, life is meted out, the opportunities, the resources, the capital, the ways in which the steps of the ladder unfold for different folks. It's hard to kind of reconcile both of those things. And I think that's where people really get stuck. It's not an argument between, the fact that if you work really hard and do really well, you can do better. It's more trying to, again, take a step back and think about, why is it that so many people have been shut out of being able to do better, despite the fact that it works for some.
So we hold both ideas at the same time.
Yeah.
And we see that this dream that we've had of being able to raise ourselves up can happen, but there are many, many obstacles. So even though we may have all been given at birth certain talents, the opportunities weren't always there. And not just opportunities, but if it was just a lack of opportunity, that'd be one thing. But we have actual obstacles that got in the way, and really was the really what keeps racism in systemic kind of racism, not just a lack of opportunities, but really obstacles.
Yeah.
So can you address, so you come to this from a different perspective than many of the people that our community know. You are a Black Jewish woman, psychologist, dean, all of those things. So what's it like for you, um, having all of those identities as one? What has strengthened the other identity? How have they been woven together to make you who you are, and to have you do this kind of work?
Yeah, I think for some people it seems novel to be, a Black Jewish woman. But for me, it's been my life. So it's not anything really that interested me. And it also, the juxtaposition of those two identities is so relative. I'll just tell a little story. So my son, my husband is African American. My son's 13 years old, and I raised him that we are Jewish. At least mom and him are Jewish. And so we were watching the news once when it was the Holocaust Remembrance. And I was saying, I was trying to explain to him, this is an opportunity for, us as Jews to, remember the serious persecution that we experienced during the Holocaust. And my son was about 5 or 6, looked at the television and looked at the people that were participating and said, well, but mommy, they can't be Jewish. They're all white. So for him, only having had his limited sort of experience at that point, he really was kind of confused. So, but for me, I would say that, a couple things. One is just that there is this way in which different sides of my family, different sides of my network have often almost, I don't want to say competed for who's most persecuted, or who's been most oppressed. And I find that really not useful, because just like you were saying about holding sort of two sort of dialectic ideas, that you can work hard and achieve, but you also may be a member of a group for whom there's many more obstacles in the way. It's also true that many groups have been oppressed and persecuted in history and currently. And so we don't need to, compare our oppressions so much. On the other hand, I will also say that I think for me, the most significant holiday growing up was actually Passover, because there was such an explicit acknowledgement of having been slaves in Egypt. And for me, as a little Black girl, I was able to connect that kind of narrative to, the narrative of American slavery, which often is the only Black history you get when you're in public school, or any school, actually, unfortunately. I hope that's changing. But I was able to connect those two parts of my identity during Passover very, very explicitly, and also kind of feel a sense of hope that experience of having been enslaved, or that experience of having been persecuted, means that these are two communities, two aspects of myself that actually could work in solidarity. If we can get over our own, as you mentioned, individual, biases and stereotypes, which, believe me, exist on all sides, but recognize the sort of common experience and the common goal, which would be, freedom, the kinds of things that people are protesting now over the last several days, freedom, the ability to live without fear, to be able to breathe, to bird, to jog, whatever, without being, seen as a threat. I think that there's a lot of power there, I think. And I think part of the task is an individual one, but also a task for, communities, organizations, temples, schools, to provide the space for people to develop a shared understanding.
I think that the oppression Olympics has really gotten in recent years in the way. Of course, in the earlier civil rights movements, there were white Jews participating. And yet, if we looked in the larger population, it was still a very small group, and they still had people who didn't always run over and join them and say, "Hey, you're doing a great thing."
Yeah.
They were in the minority and they had to stand up. And I look to Judaism to say we have that culture, or we're supposed to have that culture of standing up, and that our narrative of justice and freedom. The whole reason we were given the Torah is to create a just world, just society, and so we have that on our side. We have the Al ta'amod al dam reyecha, don't stand by the blood of your neighbor. We have love your neighbor as yourself. We have remember the stranger, remember the widow, remember the orphan, and we look at Torah as the vehicle of giving power and protection to the powerless. We understand that this we used to call it the yoke of mitzvot, the yoke of the commandments, a yoke you're sort of chained into. Um, but that's what responsibility is. That's how we're going to be a part of society. Uh,
Yeah.
so, what do you see? What what can help people psychologically in a community move from sitting back and maybe in a place of fear, or also not fear for their safety, but fear of other people looking at them? Are they doing the right thing? Are they going to be embarrassed? If my daughter's watching, she said to me, Ima, be careful you don't say anything that embarrasses Dean Cohn Wood. Don't, no, not embarrasses Dean, that embarrasses yourself. Don't
Yeah.
embarrass yourself. I said, I think I'm okay. I think I can have a conversation. But people are afraid of jumping in to be allies and maybe doing something wrong. That fear, I think, sometimes holds back individuals of maybe the white Jewish community. How do you help people get over that?
Well, I would say a couple things. One is that you know, one of the things I think is really different, which tells us maybe that we're at a kind of tipping point, is that if you look at the protests, I mean, maybe depending on what channel you watch, they're quite multiracial and multi-ethnic here in South Florida, as well as in Minneapolis. It does seem like in Washington, D.C., it does seem like all over, actually, all over the country. So, and the world, apparently. I just saw earlier on my social media about some demonstrations against racism that are happening in Italy. So I think there's a way in which, and maybe it's young people have gotten past that I think that initial kind of fear, maybe that I remember hearing from friends and colleagues that were white, afraid to say something that might sound racist or afraid to sound ignorant, that somehow there's a number of people that have been able to take a step back from that kind of individual interaction and think, no, I think there's really something wrong when there's, the huge number of Black and brown men that are incarcerated, and the growing evidence that for similar crimes, there's just vastly disparate sentencing that's happened, that representation is very disparate in the judicial system, the education, the outcomes persistently, there's a racial disparity in health. I mean, COVID for certain is showing racial disparities in how the pandemic is affecting communities of color. So I think there's a way in which the idea of systemic racism has starting to transcend, I think, that initial discomfort in engaging because of being afraid that you might actually say the wrong thing. But that said, one of the things that I love about Judaism is that it's a religion of questioning, of researching, of not accepting things, just on blind faith, of really, there's an intellectual tradition that's probably more part of my Jewish identity than a religious identity. My father wasn't particularly religious, and my mother was for a while, but then, not so much. So, so I think that history and that turn towards questioning and really examining can be really helpful. I mean, I would recommend one particular reading that appeared in The Atlantic. It's written by Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's an alumnus of Howard University, which is where I was an undergrad, got my undergrad degree. And he wrote this article called The Case for Reparations. And, reparations itself has been somewhat politicized. So whether or not you agree or disagree with reparations, that's not it. The article is really a history of the kinds of policies and procedures across multiple sectors in our society in the United States that provide for you a framework for starting to understand how race has been systematically embedded in some of these kinds of unequal opportunities that we were talking about earlier. So I think that's important. And then the third is just dialogue. So my colleague at University of Miami, Miriam Lipsky, and I started an intergroup dialogues program for undergraduates that's modeled after a program I worked with at University of Michigan. And Miriam has started also one for faculty and staff. I think the racial injustice program that you're doing at Temple Beth is the kind of thing that I would also recommend. And that is the opportunity to sit down across difference, across, life experience, across different perspectives, or even together around shared perspectives, and read and discuss and dialogue about how those different perspectives might lead us to have very different viewpoints on, what's going on in the world now, or really what any given, topic. Because, it's not necessarily that you have to change someone's mind, but I think what will lead to social change is having more of a shared understanding of why, people believe the way in which they believe, and being able to dialogue about that, because then you can kind of come to some sort of shared agreement about how to move forward, as opposed to shouting at each other or having just a very curated, access to resources or information that reflects, whatever your life perspective has been as well.
Okay. So can you give us some more maybe specific examples of systemic racism that maybe doesn't come to the forefront of our minds, but once we hear it, we'll say, "Oh yeah, now I get it." Where can you give me some examples where we can have that as a touch point for this community?
Yeah, my former colleague, actually, he's now at Harvard and I'm now at Miami, but at Michigan, David Williams is a sociologist who talks about race-related oppression in like a spider web, that it's all interwoven, that housing, healthcare, education, employment opportunities is all comes together in this spider web that creates the kind of lack of opportunity and lack of resources that we talked about earlier. But one example I can give you just from my own family. So, I have a side of my family, Jewish family, white family, and then I have a side of my family is African-American, half descended from slaves, half actually descended from free Blacks in Louisiana. I have a grandmother on my Black side who has 8 children, 4 boys and 4 girls. The oldest girl was my mother, my biological mother. Of those children, she's been able to live until 93, but of her 8 children, 5 have died. All four of the Black men, all 4 of her sons have passed away, and they've passed away from health-related issues, cancer, but also heart disease and hypertension related complications. On my white side, the deaths of family members have all been people who have lived to what you would expect to be a healthy age, even those that also may have had cancer or other serious life-threatening conditions. And that maps, that experience of loss and health-related deaths in African-American communities, and relative longevity in white communities is just, one example. I won't even get into like the material sort of income, wealth sort of differences across families, but it's an example that maps onto data that shows that while African-Americans, for example, may not get cancer at higher rates, they have much higher deaths, morbidity from cancer. There's also higher rates of almost everything, every physical health, outcome you can think of, diabetes, infant mortality. Black women, even at higher levels of education and income, have much higher rates of infant mortality than their white counterparts. So these kinds of things lead you to think, again, is there something internally deficient in the body or the biology of us as Black people that we, die or suffer from these horrible complications? No, that it really is these kinds of external factors that all combine to lead to much greater levels of stress, et cetera. That said, my research is focused a lot on mental health and the ways in which when you are, and this I think is part of my Jewish identity too, when you're a member of a group that has experienced collective denigration, you develop certain collective coping strategies. And there's a number of ways that African Americans as well as Jews have survived and thrived, you know, not just survived, but also thrived through oppression because of these kinds of collective coping strategies that are identity based, I think, that are perseverance based, maybe humor based, for example, but allow us to be able to persist despite some of the many obstacles as you talked about.
So the other day there was a dialogue at the University of Miami, and I had the opportunity to hear some of the students, mostly African American, but not all, talk about their pain. And as a community leader, it made me sad. But as a mother of young people, it was really very, very devastating to hear the pain, the fear, the fatigue that these young people are experiencing. And it wasn't hard enough trying to get onto a synchronous class at the university and finish the year, but they have really this additional trauma, and they don't really know. Well, they reached out who to turn to, but it's really overwhelming, and many people are experiencing that. Are there ways which white Jewish people can become allies, and what form does that allyship take? What is, or maybe what are some of the better forms of that allyship?
I think partly doing what you're doing now, which is taking the time and the sort of seriousness and intellectual and emotional space to understand, try to understand what things like white supremacy mean, white privilege, racism, you know, whether it's individual level or systemic racism. We've heard those words from people in places and organizations that never seem to grasp it before. You know, when I receive an email from Nordstrom saying, you know, we stand with the Black community. I mean, that's, you know, that's kind of, to me, a sign, one of these signs of progress. So I think that's important. And then also the willingness to be able to, you know, sit with the discomfort that, you know, maybe life isn't as fair, you know, because I think we like to, you know, human nature, we strongly want to believe in fairness. For everybody. And that's certainly been true for Jews across the world. And it certainly is true for Blacks in this country and across the world. And to be able to find those threads of solidarity, I think is really important. I think part of it is, you know, initially just doing that yourself, perhaps reading and, you know, and talking maybe with trusted folks, but then, you know, deciding for yourself the ways in which you might be able to be more explicit about it, I think is really important. Yeah, and then there's, you know, there's certainly, I mean, I can send you, because there's been a lot circulating over the last week or week and a half of lists of suggestions for allyship, which I think are important.
So we saw some of suggestions of allyship is to support the work of the NAACP now, campaign for zero, the work that the reform movement's doing, the Religious Action Center for Reform Judaism, the Greater Miami Jewish Federation, our Jewish Community Relations Council. So all of these organizations, as well as Nordstrom, are reaching out and trying to find these common goals. It's interesting that as the Jewish narrative looks back at the oppression and the fear and really the discrimination that has followed and even in places today in many parts of the world where it's still difficult to live out your true life in safety as a Jew, that this, and I think when we say this in the Torah, to remember others, it's not to remember as a place of fear and close ourselves up, but really to open ourselves up, to really have an open heart and an open mind. And when we look back at what ills that we have suffered and how we have overcome through perseverance, through luck, through many times passing, because we are able to, most of us, look like everybody else. and the times that's for better and times that has not helped. But all of these things can find us commonalities to move forward. So what I want to thank you for sharing your wisdom with us, for presenting us with some more of the challenges and the personal challenges, which is sometimes it's easy to pick up a sign and march in a large group, and then we go back home and then we're like, phew, okay, I did my part. But some of the hardest work is the work we have to do within ourselves, and to even recognize our own biases is a starting point, and it's not a humiliation point. It's where we start from and where we move forward.
Yeah. I agree. There's a term called cultural humility that I think is really important for all of us. I mean, for myself as well. And so it's with that humility that I will say that I am not an expert again, but I really do appreciate being able to share some thoughts with you.
Thank you. And we appreciate you. So I would, if you are on the temple emails, you saw a few letters with things you can read about, statements you can read, places that you can help. And they're circling all through all of our social media pages, many places where we can go out and be a support and be a help rather than a hindrance. And I would say that when we look back to the core values of Judaism and the core values of Torah, we want to create this world in which there's a justice, and how we run after justice, how we're supposed to be pursuing justice, and that we know when there is justice in the world, God is with us, not with us in terms of victory, but with us in giving us inspiration and spiritual sustenance and all those things that we need in our lives. So Dr. Cohn-Wood will be on campus, and well, we won't be on campus, but when we can get back to campus, we'll be interested in all of those programs. I think, we have a lot of our young people in our community who do social justice work and community organizing. Some of those programs at UM sound perfect for them. So we should recycle some of those young people back into that work. And again, as we do our individual work, building relationships, we see that we build one-on-one relationships, and the work also to changing the society and perception of society. That is a big job. Ours, as we say, lo alecha hamlacha ligmor, it is not our task. It is not our job to complete the task, but neither are we allowed to desist from working on that task. And our task is justice and racial justice, and we are committed to that. And thank you for bringing us your insights. I welcome the community to pay attention to the things that we'll be doing in the future and to reach out to learn more. And I wish everybody an Erev Tov, an evening of peace, an evening of gratitude, and of...
I have a voice. My voice is powerful. My voice can change the world. I have a voice. My voice is powerful.